After a decade and a half of close partnership, Sony has officially purchased Housemarque. The Finnish team is a mid-sized developer at around 100 heads and was founded in 1995, combining two existing teams in Finland, Bloodhouse and Terramark. Its early PlayStation Network exclusive PS3 title, Super Stardust HD, a reimagining of the team's original 1993 game Stardust and its 1996 sequel, Super Stardust, was PSN's very first critical and commercial smash hit in 2007. It was also the first game to receive trophies in 2008. Housemarque started as a PC-centric studio, and its first console game was actually the 2002 Xbox exclusive Transworld Snowboarding. It also released the excellent Ubisoft-published side-scroller Outland in 2011, ported Angry Birds to PS3 and Xbox 360 on behalf of Activision that same year, and released a self-published game in the form of 2017's Nex Machina. But Housemarque is otherwise entirely known for their work as a Sony second-party team. Following Super Stardust HD, Dead Nation came to PS3 in 2010. The PS Vita launch game Super Stardust Delta launched in 2011 and 2012. The beloved PS4 launch game Resogun followed in 2013. Dead Nation's spiritual successor Alienation followed from there in 2016. And then seldom discussed Matterfall was released in 2017. Sony funded and published all of those games, in addition to the recently released PS5 roguelike third-person shooter, Returnal. In a letter announcing the news, Herman Hulst, the head of PlayStation Studios, noted in part, quote, Housemarque's recent release of Returnal proves the studio is one with incredible vision, capable of creating memorable new games that resonate with our community. This addition enhances the creative force of PlayStation Studios, end quote. In an interview with the publication GQ, Hulst expanded on his relationship with Housemarque behind the scenes, noting that it was staff from the studio that helped his old team, Guerrilla, get PSP's Killzone Liberation out the door in 2006, a year before Housemarque's first Sony-published game. Quote, what stood out then was how technically capable the core team was at Housemarque, and you've been able to witness that in all the titles that they've been making pretty much for every single PlayStation platform since. From my perspective, they're the perfect fit for PlayStation Studios with a very strong identity in terms of kind of games that they make. They always have that super intense arcade style, but they've been able to innovate by creating their own genre with a roguelike that's got a nicely layered story on top, end quote. And yes, it sadly sounds like the days of their iconic twin-stick arcade games are done, albeit not at all surprisingly. Studio head Olari Kutinen told GQ in part that his team is, quote, looking into what we've done now and building upon it. Certainly, Returnal is kind of a stepping stone for us. When we're thinking about the future of titles, they'll maybe even be bigger and more ambitious, end quote. So that's everything there for now. Chris, what do you think of this? Housemarque is now a first-party team.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. When I think of Housemarque, I kind of think first party anyway. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like this was kind of already the case in some way, like kind of at least in the minds of a lot of players anyway. So I think it makes a ton of sense to acquire Housemarque. I'm surprised they didn't do it sooner, to be honest.
Yeah, so it seems like, Dustin, this deal was moving in the background for about a year or more. And it was interesting in the GQ article you read, which is an interview with the founder of the studio and Herman Hulst, so Larry Kutinen. He says that they have not seen each other in person the entire time this conversation has been going on. So like they've never been able to actually meet in person, although they obviously know each other. And I know him as well. They've always been really accessible when their games would be at events and stuff. And they're a really nice group of people. And like Michael Havari, who is their marketing guy, is a friend of mine, and he's a really nice dude. That they have a strong presence at these shows. So I've always appreciated their accessibility. But what do you think about them kind of joining and making this official? Like Chris said, it seems like this has been a long time in coming, and you'll be pleased to know that I was just searching for, out of curiosity, my old IGN stuff, because I used to write like, Sony should buy these 5 studios, or what studio should Sony buy? And it's always Housemarque in all the old articles. It's so funny. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think that this makes sense. Obviously, there's a good partnership there that has been going on for years. Though, Colin, you didn't mention the game Furmins that they made.
They did, yeah. They did make
for
Furmins.
Okay,
that was an iOS game, wasn't it?
iOS and Vita, yeah, but it wasn't. I don't think that was partnered with Sony at all. So that makes sense you didn't mention it. But I about died when I realized that they were the ones that made that game. So one thing that I will say that I'm sure is the case is that Sony had to have gotten Housemarque for a very, very good deal, because my theory is that Housemarque was probably in some pretty bad financial, not trouble, but like, taking on water after Nex Machina's middling success. They started working on a battle royale that clearly wasn't panning out. And then they got this deal with Sony. And then I'm guessing that they got them for a very, very good price.
Yeah, I would venture a guess of below 50 million, I would say. I mean, I don't know, but maybe that'll become public in their new financials, because you have to just consider $229 million for Insomniac, which I think is a steal. That's like that's two separate buildings and two separate states and so the rest, but maybe not. Maybe it's a little bit more than that, but I think the price was probably right. And I think also that Sony has shown a very consistent willingness to work with them, even when things weren't going great for them. And I think you'll remember that it was kind of an ebb and flow. Like Super Stardust was huge. That game was huge. Everyone loved Super Stardust early in the PS3's life cycle. That's a fucking great game. By the way, if you've never played a Super Stardust game, you absolutely must. There's a PS4 iteration that was ported by another team, but has Housemarque's endorsement and all the rest. Really good stuff. Also, the launch game for Vita, Super Stardust Delta, is in my mind the best Vita launch game and just an absolutely phenomenal game as well. But so things were going well for them with those games, but then things were a little soft. They did Outland with the Ubisoft in 2011, which was very good, but no one really played it. Like you said, they had these kind of, firm-ins. They did a little bit of port work for Activision, which I'm sure was lucrative, and all the rest. But even as things ebbed, so I would say Dead Nation is more of an ebb. I love that game, but that game had, as you guys might remember, a catastrophic rollout with it not working with online and all the rest. Then Resogun came, and that was awesome. Then they made Alien Nation, which no one really cared about. Then they made Nex Machina, which was their independent game. And then they actually went back to Sony again and made Matterfall. So Sony has always been willing to work with them. And so this seems to make sense. And I think a lot of people are now wondering what's next. So before we get into any of that, Michael Centeno wrote into us on Patreon. He says, "Hey, CC and Big D. With PlayStation officially buying Housemarque and presumably Bluepoint," we'll talk about that in a little while, "I was wondering, when a company is being purchased, how do they determine the value of the company? Is it solely on revenue or also based on the value of the IP that they own? Thanks and keep up the good work." This is what I think keeps the value of Housemarque down, is that they don't really own anything. So I think you're just buying the talent, you're buying the organization and all of the rest. It's not the same as buying Insomniac, which does own, I mean, you might not care about these things, but they do own some IP. They do own Sunset Overdrive and Fuse and others that might have some intrinsic value. I'm sure owning Sunset Overdrive is in itself worth millions of dollars. So that's a little bit of a different, I'm no intent in wearing the shirt for that reason. I just picked it out of the top of the pile. So the value, I think, is just determined based on, all of these different things. And then you have to kind of find, like, Bethesda's deal was incredibly complicated compared to a deal like Housemarque, which I'm sure is much more straightforward. But Brian Borlaug wrote in about something else, and he says, "Hey boys, with Sony's acquisition of Housemarque, what does this mean for the studio's future titles? I personally love a Resogun 2, but does the apparent success of Returnal solidify their game's directions moving forward? Could they beef up to work on multiple projects at once? I've enjoyed every game they've released, so regardless of what they do, I'd be happy as a pig in shit. Thanks for the great content and continued success of your brand, guys." Thank you for writing in. Chris, I'm curious what you think should be Housemarque's next move. In the GQ article, it's actually really quite nice. Like Alari Kutanen talks about how the studio's just gone right now. Like they're just all on vacation and they don't even know what they're going to do next. And like this news is even rolling out to them all, like they're all not together. He also notes, as I talked about in my write-up here, that they're not going to be going backwards anymore. And you might remember that he wrote a blog post like 2 or 3 years ago. I think it's called "Arcade Gaming is Dead" or something like that. So unfortunately, I don't think you're going to get these games. But wouldn't it be nice, Chris, is if they incubated a AAA game and then also just allowed a small team to make some of the cool stuff that they used to make too?
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. And I think that would be probably the best thing. But I mean, we know that's probably not likely going to happen. I just think, as somebody, like, let's say you're a developer and you're like, I really like Housemarque's games. I want to make games like that. And then you go to Housemarque and then they're making Returnal and you're like, oh, well, all right, well, there's some identity here. I get where the design would evolve into this. So it's like, all right, it's not so bad. But surely there are people at that studio who love making those types of, Resogun and Super Stardust, and surely there are a lot of people at that studio that enjoy making that kind of game. So while they seem pretty adamant that they're not willing to go backwards, I wouldn't be surprised if enough people at that studio maybe would want to, like, hey, well, we're a first party now. Maybe we could get some resources to kind of throw something together super cheap on the side that, like, maybe could rake in an extra bit of money. Maybe could even just be like a really sleeper hit on the indie side, or like, the indie side as a genre,
Right.
to kind of bolster, or kind of like, especially like with the talk of the way that you would assume that Sony's looking at Insomniac as kind of like a model, right? You would assume that Insomniac is kind of looked at as like, ooh, they can get a lot of things out really quickly because they managed to delegate responsibilities between teams really effectively. And if they can boost Housemarque's numbers as far as like, and they can boost Housemarque's staff enough that they could put out a AAA and an indie every so often, that would be pretty good for Sony, I think. And I think it would be good for Housemarque because, again, I would be shocked if there are a lot of Housemarque employees that didn't also want to continue doing Resogun and stuff like that.
Definitely. I think you hit on a very interesting point too, which is, again, keeping your company happy, the culture positive. And I think a lot of the creativity that you see in Returnal came from their work in other games. It's very weird because I'm a big Housemarque stan, as I know my longtime listeners know. I'm just been up the studio's ass forever. But when you play Returnal, you can tell it's their game. Like, it's when you really sit and look at it and see even the way things come at you and the way it is structure arcadey, like just the way things are shot, and there's rule sets that are predictable. And I'm like, this is a Housemarque game. So it would be interesting, Dustin, to allow them to do that so that they can continue to flex, find the creative ideas that they then blow up into something bigger. But I think what we can definitely categorically say now is that Sony is very pleased with Returnal and with their output generally, and feel like now is the time to lock these guys down. And they're being locked down, by the way, in a very similar way to Insomniac being locked down when they tried to go do something else and it just didn't work out very well. And so they came back home.
Right. I feel like what I want from them is to do a game, maybe, I don't want to say like Returnal, but I want them to do a game that has arcade feeling combat like Returnal, but like how you said in the past, Colin, not roguelike. Like, imagine if Returnal, instead of the repeat, which I get, it's the core of the game and the stories, so just ignore that for a minute, but like if it had lives or whatever or something like that, and continues, people would have beat that game instantly, right? So a lot of the content is stretched out due to the nature of the game. Now with, Sony was funding, but now that they're a fully owned studio, maybe they can take some of that combat formula and apply it to a game that can be full length without having to repeat content over and over to give it that length. That's what I would love to see, because I don't think they're going to go back. As much as Resogun 2 would be awesome,
Super Resogun.
I'm like, I'm kind of like, Resogun's perfect as it is to me.
It
like,
is,
what are you going to do for Resogun 2? So
it's a wonderful game.
I think that they, Sony is looking at, and they've said this, they want to buy culture at studios, the teams that mesh with how they work. Herman Hulse talked about their technical capabilities. And so I think that the main thing that they saw, or have continued to see in them, is that the potential that they can make huge games. They want to buy studios that can make blockbusters. And Returnal might not quite have been it, but maybe they have that in them in the future.
Yeah, I think Returnal clearly hasn't sold very well. And I think Sony going in and saying, you know what? Well, the game, I think they said basically the game is, I'm sure, made its money back. I don't think it was very expensive to make, but that's still being like, yeah, we still want you anyway. We still want to put a ring on it anyway, because we're so pleased with what you've done with us and for us. And so I think they're a very welcome fit. And I think they're in this space in between where Sony still does have like this weird quote unquote indie studio in Pixel Opus, right? And Housemarque is kind of like above that, but not quite where the rest of the studio's headcounts are for the most part. They're still pretty small. What I want to see is if they're going to scale up. They're almost 100, and that's way bigger than the team that made Resogun. So they're going to need more, and they're going to get more. I want to talk a little bit about some of the contradictions in this deal, but I want to talk about it later when we introduce some new data and some new news to this as well. But in the meantime, I want to congratulate Housemarque for this. This is awesome. I think that they are very welcome and make a lot of sense. And to Chris's point, they've already kind of been here anyway.